start from his question. Thank you very much. And then Alejandro Garcia Monton also. So please, first Alejandro, then Arthur, who was already had a question, and then Unschool, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrico. I'm still shocked by what happened, as all of you. Well, thank you very much, Giorgio, for your presentation. It's actually ages. I didn't hear you. I have a specific question, and I'm always wondering. Okay, we know there are certain sectors within the Republikisti that they are somehow inspired by the Dutch model, but at the end of the day, by the 1680s in Genoa, all these joint stock companies, even the convoy that used to link Lisbon with Genoa through Cadiz, all those institutions and models are not longer in use. So I'm thinking, what happens after after the putting in practice those models, and they say, well, the Dutch model didn't really work for us. How do they reimagine the Dutch model after experiencing that those models were not useful for the Genoese reality, right? I don't know if I explained myself, but we normally focus on, okay, the Dutch model as a source of inspiration, but in 30 years it's demonstrated that okay, maybe those models inspired them, but they were not useful, or even the Genoese merchants were not making use of them. In the case of the Convoyo, I found some sources in I don't know exactly which it was here in the section in Maritinarum. It's a relation of the Junta de Galais, in which they are saying, look, or connationals are not using even the convoy of Genoa. They are using other convoys. So what do you think about this? Thank you.
Shall I start? Shall I ask?
Maybe we can collect also another question for you by Arthur, and then you can reply. Please, Arthur.
Sure. Thank you, Giorgio. It was nice to hear this talk also, because Carlo Taviani once told me that actually the Dutch VOC was partly inspired by the Genoese example. So it's nice to see that inspiration coming back sort of to Genova. I was wondering, you were saying that for the Genovese, the Dutch companies are important mostly as a what might be called financial colonial model when it comes to the voluntary participation in the companies by merchants. And I was thinking, is there also a discussion about the Dutch companies as a republican political model, in the sense that these companies were in a way organized in a republican way, with for example, the Lord 17 in the case of the VOC is a sort of republican mechanism to avoid single rule by one ruler or one city. So is there, in the reflections by Genovese authors on the Dutch model, is there also a reflection in this sense of a kind of a republican company as a political entity?
Okay, shall I reply?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so starting from Arthur's question, there isn't much attention given to that, but I can also, let's say, try to explain it why there's not an attention to that thing, because in the end, all the things I proposed are, let's say, proposals, even more than projects, sometimes also actual projects, but these companies in the end don't have a long life. Most of them don't really last many years. The San Giorgio Maritime Company is the only one which fulfills, let's say, its planned duration. And in the end, there's not so much of an attention to the internal, let's say, the internal decision-making process. It's something that doesn't really appear that much in the documents. It seems that it's not so much of a contentious issue. So, for example, in the San Giorgio Maritime Company, which is the only one for which you also have different directors, which rotate throughout the years, there are not really issues of conflicts among them, or questions of or even the lock-in of capital doesn't seem to be a big problem. It's something that it's stated in the charter in the very beginning. Okay, the capital is locked in. If you want to get your money back, you have to sell your shares, and there doesn't seem to be a discussion or contentions about it. And I think that on the one hand, it might be that by the time the Genoese established these companies, in a sense, the joint stock company of trade as such is something which has been going on for quite a few decades. So some questions are more or less settled. If you want to copy the Dutch East India Company, you don't have to. You can copy the functioning without having the ambiguities about the lock-in that actually took place in the actual first years of the Dutch East India Company. And on the other, I would say that whatever organizational issues there might have been did not make it on time to get to the surface. And then, of course, there might also be the problem that we don't have so many sources. So I can just say that we don't the discussion that you refer to in your question doesn't really appear to have a big role here. Yeah, and I hope it was clear. And about Alejandro, well, there are let's say, two different ways one could approach this question. The first one is to see what happens to the Dutch model, meaning it as the joint stock model. So why they don't why they don't try to repeat it? Why they don't? What happens to whether they try to have it again afterwards, and so on. I didn't find a discussion of that model after the 1660s. There might have been, but I mean, I don't. I didn't find it personally. And what I saw was that the problems that these companies had were related to the organization of a joint stock company as such. Basically, we all know that joint stock companies are big structures that have complex mechanisms to solve the principal agent problem. Basically, you have to make sure that your agents don't try to cheat the companies. And there's something that in the Genoese companies, it happens that you cannot really rely on your agents, and then they just seem to leave the issue to let's say, to discard the model completely. I didn't find a theoretical discussion of that. And yeah, it would be really interesting. But I mean, in the end, I think that it's related to the broader question of what is the let's say, the legacy of Republicista thinking in the later part of the 17th century, which is quite a broad question, also because there are some aspects of the Republicista policy which in the end actually have a lasting legacy. I mean, there is actually a re-involvement of the Genoese in Atlantic trade. There is the new season of naval construction, and but so far I did not study the question myself, I have to say. But it also seems to me that the question has not been much studied in general, and that it needs to be, let's say, the focus of future studies of Genoese historiography. As Luca Lobasso said, once we think that the Civil Los Genoveses actually ends with the Spanish Succession War, we have to, let's say, continue the investigation in that direction. And also regarding the Dutch model, meaning how they see the Netherlands, I also have to say that I don't have much to, I mean, I didn't study much the question myself, and I cannot really reply. Yeah. So sorry if I was a bit concise, but I think there are many questions, so we're running out of time.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. So now we have a long queue. Professor Herrero Sánchez, if you want to begin, or just tell me how do you prefer?
Yeah, yes, I can.
Okay, so Professor Herrero Sánchez, then we have Professor Hans Kuhl, then George Gors, then Gloria Mormon, and Michael Martoch.
People. So sorry, because I don't know the answer the question you have, because it was difficult for me to enter again. But okay, I'm here. So if it's some repetition, if I repeat some questions, sorry for that. No, you can avoid you forget that. I was I was asking Walter about the Arisi in Milano, and about the information about if there are also strong criticism for the Vecchi in Milano, more than you have expected, because at least in Spain, the politic of Philip II in the Consejo de Estado, Arturo Pacini has studied that very well, is really aggressive against the Vecchi, no? And at the same time, they try to show themselves like the defensor of the liberty. You have showed that by Juan José de Austria, but that is a very important element, no? So he tried more to open the possibility to have new bankers and to force the Vecchi to renegotiate their situation, and is a very good politic for Philip II, because that is also linked, I told the first day, with the situation of the negotiation of the new taxes in the Cortes of Castile. So it's completely related with that, no? But okay, that is if you have this information. And for Tosco, I have, okay, for the first one is maybe there is some confusion about between the Republicisti, the Genoese Republicisti, about the difference between the low countries. No, all the low countries, the Fiamminghi, the Olandesi, the Germans, there is this kind of mixture that is not something that happened for the Genoese. That's happened exactly the same in Naples. That's happened exactly the same in Castile. Everywhere there are sometimes there are this confusion that is duplicity of personality for the low countries, and that made a lot of problems in the moments of the war, mostly for the embargoes policy and these kind of things. No, so that is not something just exceptional for the Genoese. But the question of the consideration that you and I think is interesting in Veneroso and in all the Republicisti, there are this link very strong between commerce and the development of militia, no, of the capacity of war and the capacity of interiorize the cost of protection. So is important for a state to have a very strong trade system, no? But that is not just only for the Republicisti. I'm thinking really, at least in Castile, in Naples, in everywhere in Milan also, but mostly in Castile, all the big arbitristas are all during this period. The first one will continue of Olivares. Maybe he's more sovereignist if you want, but even people are not really sovereignist. These people like the ancient world of organization and the mixed model of government. There are all the time trying to imitate the Dutch model. In Spain, is full of proposition in order to create stock action companies like this one of the Dutch. Is during all the 17th century, and at the second part of the 17th century, exactly imitating the model of the Dutch company. Instead, this theoretical Republican solidarity is not working at all. I told the first day, but I think mostly in the English Republicanistic, Harrington and all this, that they don't like at all the Dutch model. The model is really something they don't think is a good thing, because there is another kind of model of republicanism, not linking in commerce. The commerce is most the opposite really to that, no? And it's very aggressive, the politic for the Dutch the English Commonwealth against the Dutch, and is very aggressive. The act of negation, the proposition to make a coalition Republican in 1651, and it's now taken into consideration. The figure of the stadtholder is something terrible for the English, or not for the Republican. So there is very strong aggressivity between some of this republic and the position of the Dutch against the republicist measures in order to reinforce their autonomy is really one of the most critical for the company of the Genoese companies. Yeah, it's okay.
Maybe we can collect also Ansku's question and then pass to the answers.
My question is one out of ignorance, really. Well, you know that in the middle of the 17th century, the Medici had a formal agent in Amsterdam in the person of Francesco Ferroni, on which you've worked yourself quite a lot. And I was wondering, after listening to your talk and you quoting all these marvelous sources, if the Genoese had any direct information on the Dutch Republic, apart from traders, merchants, members of the artistic community that reside in Genova, or in other words, were there avisi on a regular basis sent from Amsterdam or other cities in the Republic to Genoa, and was the Genoese Republic one that bought such avisi, that maintained an agent in the Republic? Thanks.
Please, Giorgio.
Okay, so again, starting from the last question, let's say there's not a Genoese version of Ferroni, and Ferroni is who is, by the way, say it for the others, he's the Tuscan agent in the Low Countries between the 1650s and the 1672. And he appeared, and you can see that from the fact that, for example, the way Ferroni looks at the companies is much more insightful than many other foreign observers. For example, Ferroni, in a relation he sends to Florence, says quite explicitly that the Dutch East India companies don't provide profits to everybody involved, but mostly to the directors. That's the whole issue of the let's say let's call it corruption, but traffic of influences and so on. In many ways, that relation is much more informed than anything that happens in that the Genoese have know at the time. And the sources of information of the Genoese, let's say, they don't have they have for a few years a consul in Amsterdam. But this guy Giovanni Battista Isola doesn't really that is not really much active, and for the rest they rely either on the contacts of the Dutch people in Genoa. So, for example, there's one of the main links is the Sultan family, of which there's the father in Amsterdam, and then the two children are one in Genoa, one in Livorno. So that's how they get connection, and most of all also through the Genoese community of Antwerp, which in a sense operates as the Genoese window on the whole Low Countries. And so, for example, one of the
No, hanno iniziato la prima volta. Don't worry, it's nothing. It's just one of our PhD with the microphone on. Fortunately, it's not anything like before. Please, Giorgio, sorry.
Okay. So, for example, one of the sources I mentioned, the one in which there was the Dutch asked not to give interest, that was a relation of Giovanni Stefano Spinola, who's let's say, who was a journalist merchant in Antwerp, and basically is an informal agent for the whole of the Low Countries. When there's something in the Dutch Republic, they send him. And also in the 70s, D'Andrea, who's listed as a consul in Amsterdam, I think even, and who moves from who goes frequently to the Dutch Republic, is actually based in Antwerp. So it's the Antwerp connection, which is really gives information on that. And of course, I mean, we know that there are less that the Genoese merchants are more based in Antwerp than in Amsterdam. I mean, it's if you count as Italian traders in Amsterdam, you see that they're mostly Tuscans, Lombards, Venetians, but not so many Genoese. And as regards the question by Professor Herrero, Sánchez, regarding the Flemish identity, yeah, there is a lot of let's say ambiguity in that, which is also in many ways a deliberate ambiguity. It's that also the people from this community itself that sometimes refer to themselves as from the southern Netherlands and then as from the northern Netherlands, and there's a lot of let's say there's a lot of confusion. And apart from the Spanish agents, there are not really many people who want to, let's say, pinpoint people to a specific identity, and so yeah, it happens quite often. Yeah, that people and there's also a confusion between the Dutch and the northern Germans. There are people from Hamburg who are considered part of the Flemish community, and so on, and people from the Low Countries who are considered who said they're from Hamburg just because this way they're neutral, and so on and so forth. There's even a really interesting document in which at certain point there's a ship from the southern Low Countries which arrives in Genoa, and there's actually quite a dispute between the Dutch and the Spanish consul on who should ask for consular duties from the ship. And the document refers to that ship as Flaminga sed status regis Hispaniarum. So to give you, so yes. And regarding the link between, let's say, the link with the Arbitristas, yeah, one of the interesting facts about the Republicisti is that, in a sense, they are not at all a specific Janus phenomenon, but they are part of a wider European tradition, which happens also in many other countries and all across the, let's say, Habsburg board, if you want to put it this way. And also many of their suggestions are actually, let's say, have echoes in other thinkers and other proposals. So, for example, the link between trade and war, of course, it happens in the Arbitristas, but also, let's say, also in the mercantilism in general. There are lots of British thinkers who think exactly the same thing. We should have ships because this way we can use them in war. Or we should expand, for example, fishery, because then we're going to turn fishermen into sailors, and then we're going to win the wars against the Dutch. So yeah, it's all part of this European framework, and that's the same also for the references to the Dutch companies. In a sense, what I find interesting about the Genoese East India Company is that, in a sense, is an example of a much broader European phenomenon, and that can be compared to many other things happening in different European countries. in a sense, for example, probably the closest thing to the Genoese East India Company is the Danish East India Company, which seems which is started also with Danish capital and Dutch human capital, and in many ways it is a kind of Genoese East India Company with better luck. And yeah, we also have there are also many some proposals like that in Tuscany. I studied that for my PhD. This proposals in Genoa and in Tuscany, and then you can also have them in many other places. Again, it's a broader European story which should be studied in a comparative perspective, looking at the way Dutch companies are imitated in France, in Genoa, in Denmark, in Portugal as well, and so on. So yeah, it's definitely part of this broader phenomenon, and I think that's also what makes them so interesting.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. We have a really brief follow-up question by Gloria, and then 2 questions for Wouter by Professor Gors and Michael Martoccio. Then the last round of questions by Cavagnaro and Benoit. Please, Gloria, if you want this follow-up question.
I really enjoyed both presentations. Thanks so much to Wouter and Giorgio. Actually, I have just a small curiosity for Giorgio. So I really liked what you called the rhetorics of friendship, and how you can see that work actually in both ways, which is a notion that I would strongly agree with. I think I was just wondering if you see that happening beyond the strictly mercantile or state intelligence, as we can call it that, beyond that sphere. So do you see this rhetorics operate in literary works, in other spheres of cultural production?
Okay, thank you very much. We collect the 2 questions also for Wouter, Professor Gors, and then Michael Martoccio, please.
Wouter, thank you very much for both of your papers. Machiavelli and Guicciardini in their histories talk about Genoa and faction as a sort of theme, and Rodolfo Savelli's The Introduction to the Sido Catalog talks about Genoa as an anti-myth of the Italian commune, the contrast with Venice as a corporate and Genoa as a private kind of republic. In the Avvisi, does the word fazione come up? Do the Avvisi put that in the context of this image of Genoa and family faction? And so I'm sort of wondering about that, since both Machiavelli and Guicciardini sort of characterize Genoa in this way, in contrast to other republics. And I think it might relate to Holland in the sense that with the Dutch, I don't think of faction as an issue. Although it's a mercantile republic, the issue of faction does not seem to come up in the same way that it does with Genoa. And I'm sort of wondering about that issue of family faction across this session.
Thank you very much, Professor Gors. If you want to answer your question.
Yeah, I would, of course.
Wouter, first we have the question of Michael Martoccio, which is also for you. So please, first, Michael, thank you.
Yes, thank you both for your papers. Wouter, I just had a comment and a question. My comment is, I couldn't help thinking when you were going over your quantitative data of the work of John Paget, who's done this kind of work with the Consorte Pratiche. And I know one of the things that he's done is looked at the kind of combination of words. So, you have Città and then Genova, but kind of looking at those words in context and the words around them, right, and kind of mapping out more. So just kind of thinking forward in the project. My question, as it's sort of related to that, is about circulation of these documents. You often say kind of the Roman Avviso is read in Rome, and then the Milanese is read in Milan, and the Venetian. But I wonder if those are moving around, and if they're not, that's also interesting. Yeah.
So shall I answer the question?
I don't know. Maybe we can. Yeah, we have 2 more questions.
Okay, sorry.
So if you want to answer to this one, but I asked you to answer a little bit quickly.
No, that's fine. I can wait. I can wait. I'll just write them down.
Okay, so now Cavagnaro, please, and then Benoit Maréchaux for the last turn of question.
Yes, for Giorgio, I think this was a model, exists a model, and then exists the particular interest. You know, I want to know about the way if the particular interest influence that model, you know, when the Salvador sent slaves to Buenos Aires, the Dukes of Genoa was the uncle of Salvador. I want to know about this particular interest transform, you know, the model, and then the continuity that particular interest. For example, the Salvador is tied to Asiento of Grillo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very last question by Benoit, please. Benoit,
yeah, thank you. Very briefly, I have a very direct question for Giorgio, which is just to which extent do you think that the Republicanisti were truly connected to what happened in the Netherlands? To which extent are they just writers, to say this in a quite provocative way, or do you know if there are serious connections, both from an economic or social point of view, with these Dutch companies? And so my question here is that, do you consider that there were very serious alternative projects? And basically, do you think that their ideas were directly inspired by knowledge of these companies? Or do you think that, because it's another way to say it, that they could have some ideas that were quite common at the time, as Herrero Sánchez said before, and so they used then the Dutch model, I wouldn't say as a pretext, but you know, it's a way to justify and to give more weight to your argument, as very common today. Politicians going to, they say, well, you know, in this country it works very well. Well, they say this more because they think that it could be a good rhetoric argument, and maybe they do not have any idea of how it works. So I'm really not sure it was the case, but just if you have an answer on this, I think it will be very interesting, because I think that the literature hasn't clarified this point until now. Thanks.
In this sense, can I tell just one element? In this sense, following the consideration of Benoit Maréchaux for Tosco, do you think they are aware about the very strong conflict inside of the Republic between the East Indian Company and the West Indian Company? Because during this period, there is some consideration about an unification of the both company, and really one of the big strong problem was the aggressivity between one company and another one. That is something very strong, because the West Indian Company was not absolutely able to really control and monopolize the space they have to do. It's not the same situation than the East Indian Company. And that was really a strong debate inside of the Republic. That they have some information about that?
Thank you very much. Let's pass to the answer. Please, Uta first, I will say, and then Giorgio.
Okay, thank you very much. So as for the question of Professor Herrero Sánchez, yeah, I think like in general, in the whole system, you see that there's a clear preference for the Habsburgs, in that sense for the Spanish. And in particular, with reference to Milan, it's indeed very interesting information you gave about what happened in Spain. And you see also very slowly coming in information directly from Spain. But I think what these Avisi in general tend to do is that they have a more local focus. So at some point, as I think you also saw in one of my examples, there are sometimes negative about the Vecchi, but I would now say that often this more seems to be for local reasons. For example, of course, these Vecchi are collecting soldiers, which of course always see the soldiers, of course, always cause trouble for the people living there. And this is also a cause of grief that is often singled out. And there is indeed some information also coming from Spain, but less. But it would still be interesting, I think, if the thing you singled out, if it would actually also be visible in the Avisi as a cause of negative press on the Avisi, so to say. And then for the question of Professor Gors, yeah, I think it's very interesting indeed about affection. As I said, they use this, well, not a lot, but still from time to time. And also at the very beginning of the conflict in March, like the first messages that actually come in on this, they say that, yeah, the defections, I'm not sure if defections, I should check if they say this, but that they started to have trouble again, which almost has a bit of tone of not again, as in that they're continuously fighting. And of course, actually, in some sense that they refer to these old laws of 28 or 47 already has, of course, also been this idea that there already is this very long history of fighting, of conflict. The same, of course, with the exile of Scipione Fieschi. And from time to time, they also name other exiles. And for example, also when Morone is traveling from Rome to Genoa, they single out all the Genoese that travel with him. Not always really by personal name, often usually only named by their last name. So usually you can only know with the aid of secondary sources who they actually really were. And then I think the last question about circulation is really a question about Avisi themselves, but it's a very good question from Mike Martucci. Especially because, of course, I had to make some choices, but there are some very interesting other aspects. For example, the weird thing about the news from Venice is that it's hardly ever about Venice. That's not from this year, but this happens almost always, even though Venice is one of the most important, or actually the most important news hub of Italy in the early modern time. A lot of the news is actually not on Venice itself, which is uncommon because in other areas, for example, Milan and Rome, you see that most of the news is really local and it's really from itself. But the even more interesting aspect, I think, is that there's a clear connection because where are they from if they're not from Venice? Like most of the headers in this volume are actually from Rome. An interesting aspect is that either they are directly based on the volume of Rome, or they have some common sources, because many of the items in this volume, not on Genoa, but also on other items, are sometimes they're even almost perfect copies, and sometimes they're reworkings. And I think that's also one very interesting aspect of the whole nature of the Avisi, that they are a bit like texts that have their own history. And in some sense, I think that sometimes this makes even the word frequency more meaningful, because that means somebody chose what items to include and also chose what language to employ. Because, for example, if you take them together, two similar images, unfortunately couldn't find one on Genoa that was the same, which could also be meaningful. But you see that sometimes they suddenly decide to leave a sentence out, or just to say something in a slightly different way. And indeed, you can of course do way more things with word frequency and this kind of thing. So I'm of course planning to do this in the future. Indeed, with reference to these two series that seem to share a connection, the thing I of course want to do is to develop a method to compare them automatically, by which you can of course get even more, extract even more meaning from them. So I'm very curious, like to what order did you exactly refer? I didn't catch that.
Oh, sorry, it's John Paget.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. Maybe we can pass to you. I ask you to be a little bit brief because we are late on the program. Sorry very much.
Okay, I'm trying to be as soon as possible. So starting from Benoit's question, I think that at least the main Republicisti did not know much about the Netherlands, and they didn't know it firsthand. And they use it, let's say, as a topos, getting the information from somebody else. And so, for example, coming to Manuel's question, they don't refer at all to this conflicts between the East and West India companies. Still, there are some people behind the thinkers, let's say, who have a more direct connection. But they're not, let's say, the people who propose the projects, but sometimes they're the people who put the money in it. So, for example, one of the directors of the Genoese East India Company is Giovanni Filippo Gattagno, who is not a pamphleteer or anything, but it's one of the main merchants in Genoa, was born in Antwerp, and has a lot of trading connections with Dutch people. So, let's say there is also a link. But it's not a link with, to the Republicisti themselves, but to the people they collaborate with. And also some of the other people they collaborate with. The most direct cases is also in the San Jorge Maritime Company, the company in the 50s that sends ships to Brazil. At a certain point, one of the directors is a Dutchman from Genoa, Samuel Sultan Jr., who's a member of the Sultan family with the father in Amsterdam and so on, and he's also on the board of the directors at a certain point. So there is a connection not to the intellectuals, but to the people behind them. And this, in a way, is also a way to reply to Noel's question of the mercantile interests. It's not so much mercantile interests of the people who developed this model, but it looks like there are, let's say, mercantile interests when you decide to follow that model or not. So, yeah, so, for example, the San Jorge Maritime Company, there are some people who are already involved in the Brazil trade, and then they enter the company when there's the opportunity to give that institutional framework to the activities they already have. So yeah, I hope this is clear. And regarding Gloria's question, well, of course, the sources I used don't allow me to give a definite reply. I didn't, in the end, investigate that much the literature, besides pamphlets, of course, and or strictly personal documents. My idea is that for many people, of course, it's just, as I mentioned before, rhetorics, and they don't really know much or care about the Low Countries. But for some other people, it's different. And let's say the two examples I can think of are first Andrea Spinola, who actually seems to have had personal contacts, and now in the I didn't put those sources, but there are instances in his recording where he's so he makes this praise to Christopher Furtenbach, which is quite touching, actually. He says, yeah, one of the best foreigners I've ever known. He's much better than many other Genoese. I wish there were everybody would be like work like Christopher Furtenbach. And he also sympathizes, for example, with let's say the individual Flemish sailors who are arrested by the Magistrato della Bolletta. Let's say they're arrested because they don't have the necessary documents, and basically it's just small people being harassed by the police, and he's a bit sympathetic to them. And then another case where I think there would be, let's say, a direct connection is Hendrik Malman, which is the longtime consul, Dutch consul in Genoa, from the 1620s to 1648, and is the main person behind the Genoese East India Company. And we know he's in business relations with a lot of Chinese people, and he also refers sometimes as friends he have in Genoa. France, of course, it's a word. It's wide. It has a wide meaning in the context he uses them. It's more like connections. But to have had a wide Genoese network who are I mean, they appear in the consular letters of people who give him advice or to who help him, for example, freeing individual Dutch sailors who are arrested and so on. And he was also quite active in charity. For example, there's a series of prints by how's it called? That Flemish painter, De Wel. Yeah, there was a series of prints by thinker Niels De Wel about charity, which is dedicated to Hendrik Malman because he's involved in charity, and it appears that yeah, he was also involved in many different activities on that side. So, for example, for him, I would think that he had for him, friendship was not just rhetorics, and the Japanese connections were also on a wider personal level. If I had to, let's say, point to individual figures who had this thing. Whereas, for example, Stefano Spinola, the agent in Antwerp, didn't have a good opinion of the people he lived in. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think that we have a really rich discussion, wonderful papers. Even if there was this problem, everything in the end went well. So thank you very much for your patience, for your comprehension. I think that we can have the 15 minutes of break now, and then be here again at 17:20. So we can start with a little delay the second part and have our last three papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and of course the meeting will remain open in order to avoid any further problem. So see you in 10-15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Forse ci possiamo anche parlare di persona. Io sono adesso a Firenze e sono per ora diciamo bloccato qua dal fatto che c'è Regione Rossa, e sì, è un peccato non potersi vedere le persone, organizzare qualcosa. Tra l'altro io dovrei andare a Venezia prima o poi a vedere delle cose nel archivio, quindi mi piacerebbe passare, come dire, in Veneto a salutare la varia gente.
Giorgio, siete tutti chiusi adesso?
Dipende da regione a regione, però la Toscana è zona rossa, quindi sì, siamo chiusi in pratica. Cioè non si può andare fuori dal comune senza motivi, e anche nel comune in teoria deve avere una ragione per spostarti, poi nessuno controlla, però insomma...
Qua in Argentina sta tutto aperto, qua in Argentina sta tutto aperto, però abbiamo 8.000 casi al giorno, più o meno. Sta tutto aperto, perché arriverà, credo, il vaccino arriverà, credo, entro a gennaio, secondo hanno promosso il governo.
Sì.
Però è troppo diverso. Qua sta arrivando il caldo, già estate, più o meno stiamo...
Perché là è come il nostro... già, come il nostro maggio.
Sì.
Ah, giusto. Sì, anche noi... Cioè, diciamo, qua si dice che cominceranno a vaccinare la gente a fine gennaio, però ci vorrà comunque un bel po' per fare vaccinare tutti, insomma. Quindi, boh. Però ho visto comunque che in Argentina si sta riducendo la curva. Cioè, tipo che... E infatti adesso noi abbiamo più casi di voi.
Sta abbassando abbastanza, sta abbassando, i casi stanno abbassando. Io posso andare qua in La Plata, posso andare a palestra, a camminare, stanno le bare anche aperti.
Siamo un po' come diciamo, in tutta Italia c'è il coprifuoco, quindi la sera comunque non puoi uscire. E i bar sono aperti nella zona gialla, ma anche qua in realtà, però solo per in un certo orario e così via. E adesso c'è il problema di Natale, perché per esempio dicono che non ci si potrà spostare tra il 21 dicembre e il 6 gennaio. E quindi fanno, sì, e quindi o ti sposti prima o per Natale non puoi incontrare la famiglia.
Tu viaggi a Genova?
Sì, penso che andrò a Genova. In realtà già adesso penso che potrei andare a Genova tra qualche giorno, nel senso che appunto sono a Firenze, però se tanto non posso fare nulla, non posso nemmeno andare in biblioteca, mi sa che tra un po' vado, nel senso volevo incontrare Regina tra la prossima settimana, però poi vado.
E Genova è zona rossa anche?
No,
Genova è
zona gialla.
Ah, vabbè.
Stanno un po' meglio, sì. Poi in realtà adesso la Toscana dovrebbe diventare zona arancione già oggi, però appunto non c'è ancora l'annuncio ufficiale.
Qua il problema è che qua gli aeroporti hanno chiuso. Quindi stanno adesso stanno aprendo qualche aereo, però non posso viaggiare. Quindi il problema è questo. Quando devo andare a cercare a Italia il titolo da dottore, ancora non l'hanno impresso.
Non l'hanno spedito.
Non l'hanno stampato. Non l'hanno spedito nessuno. 8 mesi. Ma io ho fatto 2 domande e non mi hanno risposto mai. Quindi ho il certificato per fare tutto, ho il certificato in PDF, però senza il titolo non posso fare niente.
Cazzo. Ma hai scritto a Verdino cioè, insomma, alla fine è anche una sua responsabilità.
No, Verdino già sta lavorando per la scuola normale di Pisa.
Sì, però voglio dire, alla fine come tutto dovrebbe essere...
Quindi sì, a Giannini dovrei scrivere. però anche al titolante o qualcuno di questo che lavorano in ufficio dalla ricerca, però.
Sì.
Beh, sì, è così. Una collega ha scritto 2 o 3 volte, credo, e non le hanno risposto mai.
Bene. Ma pensi che perché pensavi di andare in Italia tra qualche mese? Sì.
Anche io. Sì, ho fatto le iscrizioni per tantissimi anni, ma anche a qualcuno, però nessuno. Ho restato fuori da uno in Madrid, credo, e altro, non lo ricordo mai, a qualcuno. Ma ho iscritto anche all'istituto e credo che mi hanno accettato la richiesta.
Bene.
Beh, non lo so ancora.
Sì,
ancora non lo so.
Crociamo le dita.
Sicuramente sarà in aprile che rispondono, però.
Sì. Sì, poi adesso all'istituto forse sono un po' più organizzati, però intanto all'università hanno avuto problemi organizzativi per il Covid. Avevo fatto un concorso a Trieste, in cui alla fine sono arrivato all'orale, ma poi non mi hanno preso, e era una cosa tipo che ho mandato la domanda a luglio, a ottobre ci hanno inoltrato, hanno fatto sapere che, a settembre hanno fatto sapere che prendevano 3 persone per l'orale è stato poi a ottobre, e per comunicare i risultati ci hanno messo, sono arrivati fino a novembre, per intenderci, per dire da 3 persone chi ha vinto.
Ma credo che sì. Spero che tutto questo cambi dopo di cominciare il vaccino, perché non posso studiare niente.
Infatti. Se io
sto qua con un libro che devo cambiare, con questo libro che devo inviare entro l'editoriale, entro a dicembre, un libro che non sono mai interessato, ma devo correggere e leggere tutto lo che scrivono altri.
Quella cosa che di cui fai il curatore, quella collezione di saggi che mi dicevi?
Sì, sono il segretario, come segretario di redazione o di scrittura, come si chiama qua. Devo inviare, quindi i coordinatori mi rompono il casino a me e io rompo il casino all'editoriale.
Sì, immagino che loro siano impegnati.
Sì, ma tiene un po' attivo, e anche sono stato in tantissimi bandi, in tantissimi congressi, anche interessato in questo, però. Questa è una forma, mi danno diciamo, il certificato, mi lo danno per mail, quindi è utile per me. Mi devo rimanere qua in Argentina, posso passare questi certificati per un postdoc o quindi qualcosa. Sono stato in uno in La UAM e un altro in Siviglia, abbastanza bene.
Il primo dov'era?
Da Madrid, della Università Autonoma di Madrid, sulla corte, con questi che hanno lavorato, ha aperto parlando benigno, per questo mi sono collegato prima, ma mi ho perso queste per queste, quindi sono un po' arrabbiato per questo.
Ok.
Gli archivi hanno chiuso tutto,
credo.
Bueno.
Sì, qui tutto.
Quindi mi manca tantissimo l'archivio, mi manca l'archivio di Genova, tantissimo.
Anche un po' un problema, perché ci sono delle cose che non ho potuto controllare.
Anche io che ho finito, diciamo, di descrivere, ho preso fotografia di tutto e con questo posso leggere i documenti. però
sì.
quindi mi manca andare a ricercare l'archivio di Genova, mi manca tantissimo.
Sì. Anche per me, anch'io.
Mi manca trattare di legare questo straccio così di documenti, mi manca quello, veramente.
L'esperienza che è bella.
È anche bellissimo. Per me che sono qua in Argentina, io ho vissuto in Italia 3 anni e dopo si è finito la borsa, quindi si è tagliato la borsa in ottobre.
Hai dovuto andare
tentato
via?
Di rimanere in Italia. Sì, ho tentato di rimanere in Italia, però ho dovuto ritornare. E dopo con il Covid ho discusso la mia tesi dottorale per Meet, quindi...
Sì, è difficile in questo periodo.
È molto difficile. Però almeno sono riuscito a fare la discussione della tesi. È un po' diverso discutere per qua, però
sì.
abbiamo tentato di...
A me manca anche già solamente che puoi andare nelle biblioteche, girare, bere un caffè, tutto.
Quindi,
per me normalmente è importante tutta l'esperienza, no?
Sì, io abitavo in fronte, in via Valdi, abitavo in fronte dell'università, quindi quando avevo bisogno di qualcosa entravo alla biblioteca, mi hanno lasciato usare i libri, quindi ho potuto leggere tutto lo che voglio. E veramente mi manca l'archivio di Genova, veramente sì, sei riuscito a studiare di là, è veramente meraviglioso, mi manca tantissimo. Anche mi manca di più che gli archivi in Spagna. Io ho dovuto viaggiare in Spagna, però per fare gli archivi mi manca tantissimo, sì.
Ed è anche più accogliente dell'archivio di Firenze.
Sì.
Il primo archivio che sono entrato è l'archivio di Firenze, quindi...
ma è meglio perché dopo diventano solamente più belli.
Sì, è bellissimo.
È vero. Per dire, a Genova avevano messo delle limitazioni quest'estate, quest'autunno, però alla fine erano limitazioni molto ridotte. Quindi per dire, ok, c'erano meno posti, ti dovevi prenotare prima, però alla fine era possibile andare. Magari dovevi chiamarli la settimana prima, però comunque ti davano i pezzi e così via. A Firenze ho sentito che adesso in pratica ti danno solo 3 pezzi alla settimana, una cosa, insomma...
Tu mi hai fatto illusionare, Giorgio, perché io pensavo che hanno digitalizzato tutto, l'inventario hanno digitalizzato. Hanno riuscito...
Excuse me, I give the word. It's 5:22, and we have to restart our second session. Thank you very much again. I would like to present the first speaker, who is Johannes Salvarani, in this 5th session of our conference, in which we will examine the evolution of the Genoese Republican discourse at the sunset of the Republic in the last decades of the 17th and in the first years of the 18th century. The first speaker, as I have already mentioned, is Johannes Salvarani, who is Associate Professor of History of Education at the University of Parma. Her research focused on the history of education in the 16th and 17th century, with special attention to the early Reformation and to the Jesuits, and on the role of education in nation-building processes, with particular emphasis to the case of the United States. Today she will give a paper titled Nelle varietà proprie della città nostra, Giovan Francesco Spinola's Istruzione familiare, Between Genoese Identity and Cosmopolitan Culture, which deals with a text belonging to another very important genre of the Genoese literature, that of pedagogical treatises. She will examine in particular Spinola's Istruzione familiare, published in 1670, comparing it with the tradition of early modern pedagogical writings. Thank you very much, and very warm welcome, Professor Salvarani. I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here to listen to your presentation also in the previous days. Here you are all specialists of Genoese history, and I am not, so I learned a lot, but I hope to give a small contribution as an historian of education in reading with you once again this often neglected text by the Istruzione Familiare, and trying to make a reflection on the difference between this text and the main pedagogical early modern tradition, and so pinpoint some features that I think can be of interest of Genoese studies more in general, more in a focused way, and so perhaps give you some more material for further studies. I try to share my screen. And I'll try also to be very fast so that we won't be late. Can you see the screen? Thank you. So I go with the presentation. Can you see the presentation? Thank you. So here is simply the title, and I'm speaking about this text. Here you can see the frontispiece of the only printed edition of this work that I didn't have to identify the author because the identification was already made by Carlo Bitossi, who identified the author. There is the anagram, but it's very easy to understand that he is John Francesco Spinola, is the nephew of Andrea Spinola, the author of Ricordi of Memories, which was already mentioned today several times. And Andrea Spinola itself, the uncle, was the author in his work, in his general work. He make also some manuscript reflections about education. But here we have a whole work about education, which was written in the mid of the 17th century. We cannot know at the moment the exact time, and printed, as you can see from the frontispiece, in 1670. It was printed only in the first part because, as also the author says in the introduction of the book, it was written for his son, Niccolò, who died early. So the second section of the work, which was devoted especially to politics, so perhaps it was the more interesting, it has never been written, probably. The first section is devoted to education and organization of the household, but it is anyway very interesting because it is very original, very particular in the context of the literary genre of the institutiones. Here I summarize some of the features of this humanist and Renaissance literary genre, institutiones, which developed a lot between 15th and 16th century. So starting from the well-known work by Vergerio, Paolo Vergerio, the older, about education, and so starting at the beginning of the 15th century, and then following for 2 full centuries, also not only to express idea about education, but also to sustain and develop the role of the preceptor as the educator of the nobleman, as an important role in the context of the noble families. So there was also something like a professional revendication from the educators. And the major works in the Renaissance were connected with smaller Italian courts in the north, especially the Gonzaga and so on, because they needed, in the comparison with the bigger powers, also to justify themselves with the cultivation of culture, of arts, and so on. almost all traditional texts are elaboration on the well-known De Liberis Educandis, which was attributed for centuries to Plutarch. It was printed as the first, in ancient edition, was printed as the first book of the Moralia, and it was translated into Latin by Guarino Veronese, another of the most famous educators of the Renaissance. So almost all these texts contain development, translation, elaboration of this text, which is at the core of the pedagogical tradition. And when they go to the disciplines to study, they normally follow the trivium and the quadrivium. But of course, there is a special attention to rhetoric because of its political function, which are explicitly sustained by all authors. And more all along the 16th century, manners and behavior are included as a preparation to courtly life. And of course, this line became very visible with the classics such as Cortegiano, Nella Casa, Guazzo, and so on. And here we only to see, to express more this tradition, we see a very well-known, but very also significant quotation from the Ingenius Moribus et Liberalibus Studis Adolescentiae by Pier Paolo Vergerio, written at the very beginning of the 15th century, where he says, elaborating on classics, that gives a definition of liberal studies, the famous definition of liberal studies as convenient to a free man, with which he can follow and develop knowledge and prepare to excellence. And there is a very clear division between the minds which are not liberal, that seek money and pleasure, and the liberal minds which seek virtue and glory. And almost all humanist pedagogies explain that being interested in money and possession is not good for the development of the gentleman. Of course, this is totally different in our book. We here can see, here I simply copied in the slide the summary of the book, and where there is, you can see in italics, I make evident the chapters which are new. The other are rather traditional, about God, about the poor, about what to study, good manners, friendship, how to dress. This is quite traditional. But then we have necessary expenses, superfluous expenses, gambling, and then some chapters about parents and the family, and again, how to manage the household, furniture in household, how to govern money, how to be a good merchant, financial rents, real estate, feudal property, and all these are totally new in the pedagogical tradition. At the end, like something like a last homage to tradition, we have the chapter about moral virtues. And here there is a sentence which is typical, and I think can summarize the novelty of this book, because all in history of education, we speak about the war on letters, le armi e le lettere, as a paradigm of humanist education, while here it declares today all the activities suitable to noble persons are three: letters, war, and trade. So from the two typical activity of the identity of the nobleman, we add trade. And this is given like taken for granted by the author. He doesn't explain it. For that is totally evident. In this book, we can see a lot of influences. Here I can try to summarize some of them. In the work, there are quotes that are typical, we already said that, Plutarch and the classical authors, Castiglione della Casa and Guazzo about manners, but also several references to Alessandro Piccolomini, Istituzione dell'uomo nato nobile e in città libera, which was very interesting for him on the political side. And I guess it was, he would have developed more the analogies between the inspiration to Piccolomini if he had written the second part. Here are only some hints, but he quotes explicitly Piccolomini. It says the interesting book and says the use, as we will see soon, the expression in città libera several times, in the free city. But also he quotes explicitly also Huarte, the Examen de Ingenios, one of the most new and new pedagogical works of the 16th century, but not explicitly, but very clearly, Cultura degli ingegni, the cultivation of minds by Antonio Possevino, the Jesuits, which was already mentioned in several talks in this conference, and which responds with this cultivation of minds to the examination of minds by Huarte. And also we have a new, more recent reference like Jean de Sion, the Ministre d'Estat, which was prohibited, and he says that in the very, with proudly, he says proudly it is to read. Jean de Sion worked with Richelieu, so I think it's also, it could be interesting also to go deep inside this connection and this political inspiration. Here we have an example, a quote from the book, where he says it's important to learn modern languages, to learn French and to learn Spanish, and this could be normal in the 17th century, but not normal to be said in an educational work, because they usually went along the tradition and recommend only Latin. So recommending to study French in order to read Monsieur de Sion and to read Spanish, to learn, yes, he said, imparare la lingua come anche la spagnola, essendovi nell'una e nell'altra libri di molta sostanza, so to assess modern works in these languages. And at the beginning of the paragraph, it starts with Plutarch. So it puts together in the same pages, we are in the section about studies, traditional section about what the young must study, this transition, the very fast transition from tradition to modern works, where he mentions also a prohibited work about politics. Here only wanted to focus, but I can go on, about the tradition of the Liberis Educandis by Plutarch. Here the beginning, this photo is the one, a very old print, the incunabulum of the Latin translation, and there are dozens of translations in languages for older Renaissance. And here the other book mentioned by Spinola, Le Ministre d'Estat, by Jean de Sion. I couldn't found an image of the first edition. This is the second, but indeed it was a very recent book. It was at his time. Here from the introduction, he says that the reason for which he wrote this book, it was to teach his son the role of political and civic prudence. So it's a virtue, the political virtue par excellence, that was also at the same time picked up by the Jesuits and developed in a new system of making religion and politics mutually functional. And so it picks up a classical theme of the prudence, but gives to it a new meaning, because saying prudentia in the age of the Jesuits were very different to say prudentia in the classical tradition. And he emphasized, because you are born in a republic that is a città libera, a free city, as Piccolomini says. So the republican status of Genoa needed a peculiar prudentia, and so needed a new political education. And he says to be a good citizen, e conferendo grandemente a questo il buon governo della propria casa. To be a good citizen, you have to have a good management of your household. So this is, I think, perfectly in the line of the patrician tradition of Genoa, where big families exemplified and were able to manage the government of the city. And here the reference to the I wanted you to show all the frontispiece of the books he quotes, because I think there are possible inspiration for further research. So here one of the places where he quotes Piccolomini about the management of marriage. And here it's quite different from the tradition. The tradition from Plutarch in the educational literature speaks about marriage, especially about the origin and the blood of the parents, and here it takes from Piccolomini, who takes it from Aristotle, but the theme of the age of the marriage, making it later, not at 10, not to marry at 10 or 12 years old, in order to make it more rational, to make better choices and make stronger sons and daughters. But I can't stop on it, so I have to go on. And here, one of the examples, we will see more, where here we can say that there is a blueprint, a Jesuit blueprint. He makes the first chapter about religion. This is traditional, to speak about God in the first chapter and then go on. They are very, normally the humanistic pedagogy was more on the cultivation of classical virtues, so philosophical virtues. But here he makes a direct reference to the morning exercise of spiritual exercise. So, and the scrutinio, he says squitinio, but it's clearly the scrutinio of your conscience, to reflect, make the examination of conscience, and that is better to do that instead to go every day to the mass and continuously to pray and make a external form of devotion. This also is a theme we can find also in Antonio Possevino, where he makes a chapter about how a young man found the strength for his studies in exercising daily, in practicing daily the spiritual exercise. This is very similar also on the phrasing. And here there are the two books I mentioned before. This is the Esame degli Ingegni, the Examen de Ingenios, the Juan Huarte, the Spanish physician, which wrote this groundbreaking work. The first edition was in 1575 in Spanish, and then many translations followed, in which he explained how all cultivation, all education comes from natural talents. So you have only to find the right talent, and then the teacher has practically nothing to do, and gives a lot of medical on the developing on the Galenic tradition, gives a lot of advice on how to produce intelligent sons and daughters eventually, and how to improve intelligence only recurring to medicine. Antonio Possevino responds, which is cultivation of mind, cultura degli ingegni, so esame degli ingegni, cultura degli ingegni is clear, and it also says in the text which he responds to Huarte, he accepts the idea of natural talent, but says that also accepting it like that will be negating, denying the free will. Of course, it was impossible for a Catholic and a Jesuit, so he simply says you have to admit that with the cultivation with good teachers and good schools, of course the Jesuit schools, because it's also self-promotional text, you can reach excellent results even if you are not the best talent in the world. And he makes, and here Spinola tries to put together the classical idea of education, of the importance of education, and this modern idea by Huarte, saying that at the beginning, in the first half of the page, here he speaks about the importance of education, repeating an example that was in the Liberis Educandis. It was drawn directly from Liberis Educandis, where Lycurgo, the Spartan king, took two dogs, and these dogs were educated in a different way, and one of the dogs became very fiery and eager to catch food, and the other were very domestic. And while in the second half, half of the page, in a few paragraphs, I have to cut something in the middle, but not so much, speak about Huarte, the doctrine of Huarte, and says that it's important to consider talent when fathers choose the career for their son. So, and here it's it takes the occasion to condemn the practice to give some of the sons to the church. And clearly he prefers also later to use religious schools, religious colleges, but then give back the children of the noble families to the business, to secular career. And yes, and also in another section with very similar phrasing, so yes, here I think it's direct source, speaks about it's not important anymore to look for the preceptor, to look for the teacher, the personal teacher of your son, because you can, there are so many colleges under the discipline of religious people. I think it's clearly the Jesuits, because he speaks about collegi e università nelle città principali d'Italia, and in Genova the university also has a Jesuit foundation. So he says you go there, you don't need to look for the traditional magister, because you can go in these colleges, have the best education, and go out of your home to learn. So anymore the model to learn at home, but the model to go out and put yourself in the world and learn by the word. And this is also a concept given by Antonio Possevino, where he says, speaks about the school of the world, scuola del mondo dove l'uomo impara, and he says there is a better school, the best of all is the school of the world, where you learn from facts and experiences, and God is the teacher of this school. So it's better to stay in the world to learn from the adventures of life. Here I added today, because hearing the presentation about by Fusco, I remembered that there were references also in this, also in Spinola, about the Swiss and the Dutch model. It says because he said, trade is a foundation of our liberty. Nobody should say that it's not, we are not like the other nobles because we trade. On the contrary, we can say that we are very good because there are the Swiss. We are very rough. We live in a very simple way, but and they fight for money, for gold, but their freedom and their togetherness is very estimated. And at the same way, there is a great reputation of the Dutch because they go on only on commerce. Le loro forze nodrite solamente dal traffico. So if we look at this model, so we shouldn't say nothing negative about, nothing derogatory about the Genoese gentlemen who live on trade. And also there is very interesting, but I only put here it, I am going to the end, as a stimulus for future research. He says that in real estate and in financial trade, the best is not to make trade with France and Spain, but only Venice is the one to which the Genoese gentleman should give his money because this money will come back surely, as it was quando, volendosi sgravare da rigoroso interesse vitalizio contratto in tempi urgentissimi di pestilenza, restituì fedelmente l'intero capitale. So it's reliable on the side of finance. And so I wanted simply to put some research questions, open research questions about this book. How did this work connect with the political history of the Republic? If this is a little rhetoric, I think the redaction of this book was also expresses the feeling of being weak, being like the little cohorts in the northern Italy where the first pedagogical books were born, to feel a little in the middle of bigger powers, which were the main reasons for which he chose this educational model with clear inspiration in the Jesuits, and how this can help us to understand more about Genoese history. And I think that at the end, he summarizes very well, saying, I don't want to be criticized because I speak about to live prosperously. Normally, the author of such books speaks about how to bear difficulties, how to live, accept poverty. But I say, here we are always changing, le varietà proprie della città nostra. We can have, we can be rich, and the day after we can be poor. So it's good to cultivate how to manage these riches in good times and not to think about the bad ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Salvarani. Very, very interesting paper. We had another genre, another kind of text to our research. I think that it was really interesting, this close reading of the Spinola's Istruzione Familiare, because with your competence, with your experience on this tradition of pedagogical treatises, you very, very, very clearly showed how these treatises was built on some of the Jesuit topoi, on some sources very well determined within this tradition, but it has also some originality. I was thinking about the possible models outside the genre of pedagogical treatises for Spinola's Istruzione Familiare, also thinking about your first question, how did it connect with the political history of the Republic? I think I have a suggestion about one text that could maybe be a source, not the only one, but one of the sources of Spinola, but maybe I will add this point at the end of the discussion. So thank you very much again. And now we can introduce the second speaker of the session, who is Emilio Perez Blanco, who graduated at the Universidad Complutense de Madrid, where he is currently PhD candidate with a thesis project on the Hispanic monarchy in the 9 Years' War, under the direction of Bernardo José García García. His research focused in particular on the embassy, both Genoese and Spanish, but also Dutch, during the 9 Years' War. Today, he will give us a paper titled Neutrality in Question, Genoa, the Embassy of Spain and the Consequences of 1684, which is precisely centered on the vision from the Spanish perspective of the Genoese neutrality in the years of the French bombing. Thank you very much and welcome again, Emilio. I give you the floor.
We can't hear you. We definitely see the shared screen. But not hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yes. Well,
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Enrico and Alessandro. Thank you to Risk Association and the participants of this very interesting cycle of conferences. In my lecture, I will try to say, well, can you see me or?
We can see the presentation.
Yes, okay. Well, in my lecture, I will try to shed light on the Spanish.
Please only see the presentation small. If you can put it in presentation mode, it would be bigger.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. In my lecture, I will try to shed light on the Spanish point of view of Genoese neutrality and the challenges they had to face at the end of the 17th century. This neutrality was conditioned by two factors: the progressive deterioration of relations between Genoa and Spain since 1627, and the effects of the attack of 1684. First of all, a bit of context. The Spanish monarchy ceased to be the great European power with the signing of the Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659. Since then, in an increasingly multipolar Europe, France managed to become the hegemonic power, taking advantage of the weakness of its great rival, the Catholic monarchy. In this context, Hispano-Genoese relations worsened considerably throughout the 17th century, in a prolonged process that began with the suspension of payments in 1627. In the 1650s, specifically in 1654, the tension became more evident. In turn, within the Republic, as some of our colleagues have explained, the development of republicistic or navalistic thought took place since Umberto Foglietta published Le cose della Repubblica di Genova in 1559. One of the arguments of the work lay in the rearmament and distancing of Genoa from Spanish influence. Precisely in 1650, the publication of Il Genio Ligure Risvegliato had to consolidate as a cornerstone the republicistic thought. The crisis of 1654 brings together some common elements that will be repeated later in a difficult situation, that of the 9 Years' War. And it was mediated by the consequences of the bombing of the city in 1684. The crisis of 1654 took place as a result of the capture of several French ships by Fina Line corsairs, vassals of the King of Spain, in what Genoa considered to be the waters of its sovereignty. In the escalation of tension that followed the incident, Genoa accelerated its rearmament plans, and Spain seized the assets of the Genoese merchants in Italy. Now, France was determined to maintain an expansionist policy against the merchant republics of Europe and to defeat the Habsburgs of Madrid and Vienna to finally establish its hegemony in Europe. Genoa, in addition to its political and economic ties with Spain, was under its protection, meaning this a limit to its full sovereignty. Genoa was also a key piece of the Spanish defensive system in Europe, which formed a triangle around France, as we can see here. Firstly, because of the right of passage of troops through Ligurian territory, and secondly, because of the use of the ports of Genoa and Finale for the supply and hibernation of the king's navies. Dealing a decisive blow to Genoa could seriously compromise the defense of the Spanish monarchy and integrity of its dominions. In 1684, France knew about the construction of 4 new galleys in Genoa and the acceptance by its government of the credentials of the new ambassador Juan Carlos Bazán in February of the same year. These credentials constituted a real diplomatic problem between Genoa and Spain, that the predecessors Manuel Coloma and the Marquis de Villagarcía already suffered, since the Republic did not accept the inclusion of the word protection in the letters, claiming that, as we can see here, the senators considered that the word protection violates the sovereignty of the Republic and only recognized one sovereignty, that of the Blessed Mother of God, the Virgin Mary. Juan Carlos Bazán managed to, on the other hand, managed to convince the Duke and the senators that, and these are his words, it did not cause any harm, the word protection, to the rights of their freedom. These two incidents, added to the interruption of salt trade in Savona, were enough for France to carry out a direct armed intervention in Genoa. According to the manifesto of the Marquis of Seignelay, the French commander, Genova was to destroy its 4 galleys, renounce the protection of the King of Spain, and commit itself to strict neutrality. The refusal to respond to the demands led to the bombing of the city for 3 days. The conflict culminated in a humiliating visit of the Duke of Genoa to Versailles, and the privilege granted to Louis XIV to be able to send an ambassador to the city, thus breaking the diplomatic monopoly that Spain had held until then. It is interesting to mention that right after the bombing appeared an anonymous account entitled Ingenua y desnuda relación de lo sucedido en Génova en mayo de 1684. We can translate it as a original and true relation of what happened in Genoa in May 1684. It was probably printed in Milan, but we don't know, with the help of Ambassador Juan Carlos Bazán. This is still a theory. In this pamphlet, it is necessary to highlight the weight that the author gives to the acceptance of the credential in deciding the bombing of the city. In page 6, we can read that Genoa had recently, one of the main reasons of the bombing was that Genoa had recently embraced and admitted the declared protection of the Catholic king. Moreover, it provides the point of view of Spain in page 9. The relation defended the subordinate role of Genoa with respect to Spain in Aristotelian terms, referring to the association of the lunar and sublunar worlds, where the dominions and principalities are maintained as sublunar bodies by the same means that are engendered, inferring to be very proportionate that the Republic trusts the preservation of its liberty to the one who outed. This account was sent precisely to the Marquis of Castelmoncayo, Spanish ambassador to the United Provinces, and probably was read during the General State session that took place that year. This could be one of the proofs that point to the Spanish ambassador, Juan Carlos Bazán, as a probable author, not only for his extensive knowledge of classical literature, but also because of the diplomatic connection between the Spanish embassies in Genoa and The Hague. This diplomatic link between Spain's embassies in Genoa and United Provinces was also vital for the defense of the Spanish monarchy and its coordination. From 1684, Genoa committed itself to a more neutral policy with respect to Spain and France, and also to a slow disarmament, starting with the destruction of its 4 galleys and ending with the sale of its last galley. I'm sorry, I'm going to drink a bit of water. Excuse me. From 1684, Genoa committed itself to a more neutral policy with respect to Spain and France, and also to a slow disarmament, starting with the destruction of its 4 galleys and ending with the sale of its last galleon in 1689. Again, and despite the signing of a defense treaty with Spain in the autumn of 1684, Genoa had to yield to Spanish mediation in the Truce of Regensburg, to which it was unable to present itself separately and commit itself to obey the terms of neutrality dictated by France. From then on, Genoa lived under constant fear of a French retaliation, such as the bombing or the occupation of its territory. This sensation, the Spanish ambassadors knew very well that the Genoese were nervous. At the time of France's declaration of war on Spain in 1689, the question of neutrality made Madrid fear a possible break with Genoa and the collapse of the defensive system. So that until 1697, Spain forced Genoese neutrality on more than one occasion and oriented it towards a benevolent neutrality with Spain, despite the threat of the French armies in Savoy since 1690. In turn, the Genoese tried to assert their independence by appealing to neutrality, and even benefit from it like other neutral countries through a commercial blockade imposed by the Allies to France. So Genoa began to distance itself from Spain to avoid Louis XIV's suspicions. In 1686, Genoa denied Spain the entry into the city of chains of prisoners for the galleys of Spain, allowing it only in St. Pierre d'Arena and not within the city as was done until that year, to which was added the refusal to allow mooring Navy ships, except galleys, based on a precedent of 1683. But there were more during the 17th century before. Nevertheless, the dock for the galleys of the Duke of Tourcy, of Genoese origin, continued to function at the service of the King of Spain. However, in September 1692, Admiral Pedro Corvette's navy arrived at the port, an event to which apparently the Genoese were not prepared. Although Corvette later reported that it would enter the dock with the flagship or nave capitana and 4 other ships that needed repair and supplies, in reality, he entered with 16 ships, the entire navy. The protests of the Republic were such that the Marquis of Leganés himself, the governor of Milan, had to go from Milan to Genoa. But this maneuver coincided at a crucial moment in which the arrival of the Anglo-Dutch Navy well, can you see the?
Yeah, nothing happened. Please go on.
Thank you. But this maneuver coincided a crucial moment in which the arrival of the Anglo-Dutch Navy to the Mediterranean was expected to join that of Spain, and the request of a dock for the galleys of France, and finally, dangerous issue, which was that of the winter barracks, of which I will speak later. Spain asserted through this show of force its superiority at a difficult time in the war. On the other hand, although Genoa maintained the right of passage of Spanish troops through its territory, it did not grant said right in 1691, interrupting until 1692 any type of movement towards a Milanizado. Again, the question of the winter barracks was behind of such a decision, and it is precisely this question that placed Genoese neutrality between a rock and a hard place during the 9 Years' War. For its part, Spain stopped using the Genoa dock, finding its substitute in Gaeta in the Kingdom of Naples. Thus, Spain avoided diplomatic conflicts between Genoa and France. The question of the imperial winter quarters began at the end of 1691. The Allies wanted to make Italy one of the main theaters of war, and for this the Emperor, at the request of Spain, assigned large contingents of troops to Milan. Due to the lack of means to pay the imperial troops, Spain and the Empire agreed to charge the maintenance of the Italian states linked to the Holy Roman Empire and imperial fiefdoms of northern Italy. Many of them belonged to the Genoese nobility. The payment of 92,000 escudos fell on these families, which was soon refused by the Republic. This time, the Republic was encouraged by France, which was trying this time to carry out a policy of threat and rapprochement. This policy consisted of threatening to declare war and bomb the city in case the payment of the quotas exceeded 30,000 escudos, at which time France would consider Genoese neutrality broken. To make matters worse, France tried to present itself in the event of the outbreak of war with the empire, which was glimpsed in 1692, as the protector of the liberties of Genoa, thus replacing Spain. Thanks to the management of Juan Carlos Bazán and the governor of Milan, Marquis de Leganés, it was agreed that the assets of the nobles in Milan, Naples, and Sicily were seized to pay the remaining 62,000 escudos. The so-called old nobility of Genoa had to assume this payment, which worried Juan Carlos Bazán, who in his final relation as ambassador in 1693, final account as ambassador in 1693, advised against the embargo method due to the damage it was doing to the Spanish party in Genoa, taking into account that some of the members of the new nobility considered themselves pro-French and had their own French party. It is important to mention that the first step taken by Genoa during this juncture was to ask for help to Spain, revealing that the Republic was still dependent on Madrid's will and protection as much as it tried to deny it in order to avoid an attack from France. Well, here we can, this information written by Ambassador Juan Carlos Bazán, we have his observations about the nobility in Genoa. He knew that existed a Spanish party within the old nobility, and also the Republicisti, as we can see here. The few of them who do not adhere to the Spain are neutrals or Republicisti. But it is interesting that Juan Carlos Bazán did not, and Spain did not consider these Republicisti as a threat to the Spanish hegemony in Genoa. As we can see at the end of this presentation, His Majesty can be compliant with the neutrals, for they will adapt easily to our party. The new nobility could be more difficult. The new nobility, many of them were neutrals, but many of them belong to a French party. But here is a contradiction. The new nobility tried, as Juan Carlos Bazán says, tried to promote the interests of the French crown, but without altering the present state of the Republic, because all of them declared neutrals to protect Genoa from war. In his final report as ambassador, Juan Carlos Bazán concluded his report highlighting the intimate but fragile relationship between Spain and Genoa and underlining Spain's role as protector of Genoa's freedoms. In any case, the offenses committed by the Republic, mainly as smuggling, were to be understood not as a malice or ties to France, but as a sinful characteristic of a mercantile republic. All in all, Spain also used the great networks of Genoese nobles and politicians embedded in the monarchy to obtain diplomatic success during this crisis. For instance, Secretary Bernardo Salvago, who is a good friend of the Marquis of Leganés, came to his inn during the conversation, he amiably exhorted him to promote the spirit of the Republic with his good offices, so as not to let it end up using force. This was communicated by the Marquis to the Duke through the Duke of San Pedro. The Duke of San Pedro was son of the third Marquis of Albaces, Spinola, once ambassador to France in 1678 and a state councillor of Genoese origin. The third Marquis of Albaces was also a friend of Juan Carlos Bazán, Spanish ambassador to Genoa. So this web shows that part of Genoa, part of the ruling class in Genoa was not interested in breaking with Spain. Yes. Despite Genoa's attempts to remain neutral, Spain's bond was still important enough to be ignored. The evidence of asserting its independence navigated precisely in that direction, through neutrality, but always with a certain permissiveness on the part of Spain, that, as we have seen, could make effective demonstrations of force and condition many decisions taken in Genoa, with a large amount of resources and guarantees that France could not provide. In any case, its policy of neutrality was due to the fear of a repetition of the bombing of 1694. From the end of the 9 Years' War, Genoa remained under the protective mantle of the Spanish crown until the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was very interesting paper, very interesting to enter in this diplomatic document, in these letters of Manuel Coloma and Juan Carlos Bazan. I think that this shows us very well that the Spanish perspective on this genuine neutrality, from this idea that Genoa was bombed because they accept and needed the protection of the Catholic king, to then all this documentation about the suspicions in Genoa towards the French. And I think it was also another very interesting point, that the relationship between independence and neutrality, that maybe we will discuss later. I think that will be, there will be a lot of questions. So I want to proceed faster and go to our last speaker. We finally arrived at the last paper of the conference, that of Michael Paul Martoccio, who is an historian of Renaissance Italy, whose research interests intersect economics, political science, and military history. He received his bachelor at Duke University and his PhD in history from Northwestern University. He has held fellowship at the Ohio State University, Northwestern University, and he received several prestigious grants by, for example, the Renaissance Society of America, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the Newberry Library. He is currently postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oxford within the ERC project, the European Fiscal Military System, and he explores in particular the case of Genoa. Today, he will give a paper titled "The Pride of Their Ancestors Without Their Power: The Military Decline of Genoa Through Austrian, Dutch, English, and French Eyes, 1684-1714, in which he will examine how Northern European military writers describe the Republic of Genoa in the 2 decades following the bombardment of 1684. Thank you very much, and very warm welcome, Michael. I give you the floor.
Thank you, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Good. And
Yes.
then, does my screen share? Everything good? Great.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, thank you so much for sticking with us till the end here. I'm going to try my best to stick to the time given so that we can have a good discussion, and I'll go out about our weekends. I also wanted to thank Enrico and Alessandro for putting this all together and for just dealing with the complexities of having to make this all online. You've really done just an amazing job, and I think we're all very thankful for this. Now, the talk I'm going to give today is part of a larger project that's just in its first stages that looks at Genoa from 1683 to 1797, especially the city's growth into a major center for military enterprise. This includes the transportation and supply of Spanish, French, British, Dutch, and German troops, as well as the city's role in the financing of war through private families and public funds. And I'd be happy to kind of go and talk about how this talk today links to the larger project in question Q&A. But why don't I get started? So I would like to start my talk today with an unusual, let's say that, an unusual count of greed, murder, penance, and redemption from Genoa in the late 18th century. This strange story can be found in a series of letters written by the English poet, travel writer, and salon hostess Anna Lady Miller, who had embarked on a tour of Italy in the 1770s, during which time she visited Genoa. As Lady Miller told it, one day she was walking into the Basilica della Santissima Annunziata to marvel at, quote, its profusion of marble, the luster of which dazzles the sight, only to run into, on the steps of the immaculately white church, quote, a very poor old man, dressed poorly, who licked the steps with his tongue in the shape of crosses, from one end to the other. This he repeated every day at the same hour. Curious, obviously, to know why this man persevered in, quote, so singular and disgusting a penance, she approached the old man, who proceeded to wow the noblewoman with his story of woe. The old man had been a trained assassin in his youth, responsible for at least a dozen murders. Murder being, according to Lady Miller, quote, no uncommon plan at Genoa. Un colpo di coltello is seen in much the same light here as the bruises acquired by boxers back in England. Inquiring a bit more, the old man, who Lady Miller referred to as her Cicciarone, her local travel guide, this Cicciarone remembered how, following one of his murders, he had, quote, concealed himself on board an English or Dutch ship for a short time, after which he reappeared and continued his business. Only when time finally caught up to him was the Cicciarone finally gave up murder and found a confessor who recommended to him the above humiliation of licking the steps with, quote, scores of aves and paters. Now, the story of Lady Miller's rather unusual Cicciarone captures the topic I would like to talk about today, and that's contemporary foreign views of Genoa and its republic in the decades after the French bombardment of 1684. The argument I would like to make is that foreign visitors to Genoa in the late 17th and early 18th century held two visions in their head about the Republic. On the one hand, the dominant view of Genoa was of a republic in steep decline, a Genoa of murder, lawlessness, decadence, and superstition, full of Cicciaroni like the old man Lady Miller met. This is the way that most scholars who look at travel literature of this period talk about Genoa, if they talk about it at all. Yet, I also want to consider again that step-licking Cicciarone story, especially the moment when he hops aboard the English or Dutch ship to evade capture. And I think there's another side to foreign accounts of Genoa in the last decades, of an internationalizing city, of a city full of foreign spies, travelers, generals, and merchants. Thus, my talk today wants to interrogate these two contrasting views of Genoa in hopes it can help explain in a bit better detail both the Republic's decline as well as its surprising endurance. The sources I draw on are a combination of diplomatic correspondences from the English, Dutch, French, and Austrian consuls or envoys at Genoa, alongside a number of military and civilian travelers' accounts of the city in the period from 1684. Here's a sample of the accounts that I use. On the bottom half are English or British accounts, and then on the top are French, Dutch, and German language. I'd hoped to get more Spanish and French accounts, but sort of archival limitations prevented that. But hopefully in the future, I can kind of rhyme this out a little better. You'll also see the various wars that are going on during this time. I put these in here not because Genoa was a combatant in these wars, as we just learned. It was a neutral power, except obviously in the War of Austrian Succession. But it is worth saying that many of the travelers who I'm going to look at came to the city on war business, either as soldiers or merchants or simply as travelers who commented on the military situation. As historian Roy Sweeney has noted, foreign travelers to Italian cities in the 18th century, like the ones listed here, followed well-scripted itineraries that circulated around Europe at the time. Quote, there are so many descriptions of Genoa in our language that I shall take up the reader's time with those things only that have been left unobserved by others, the writer John Breville noted during his visit to the city in 1726, before, of course, going on to list all the places one would imagine a foreign visitor would comment on. The city's narrow streets, its palazzi, its civic monuments. Foreign travelers possess then a clear understanding of the city before their visit. But what did they say about the Genoese Republic once they arrived? What I'm especially interested here is where in Genoa's cityscape did foreign travelers take the opportunity to discuss the themes of this conference, the nature of Genoa's republic, its core institutions, its decline, its perseverance. The first place, of course, was the Palazzo Ducale. John Breville's account that I just mentioned here can prove representative. In his description, he notes that the Palazzo Ducale, quote, the Doge resides in a palace belonging to the Republic with his family and 8 senators appointed for his council. It is an old, mean building, the left side of which is assigned to the Doge, whose table also is defrayed at the public expense, standing as it does almost in the center of the city, and is guard at the entrance, Breville wrote. Breville was typical, as was typical, went on to provide in-depth descriptions of the twin colossal statues of Giovanni Andrea Doria and Andrea Doria as saviors of the Republic. Beyond the official seat of power, travelers further commented on the nature of the Genoese Republic while visiting the city's many private palazzi. For many of the visitors conducting the grand tour, the marvels of the Palazzi of Strada Nuova and Via Balbi not only informed an essential part of their accounts, but also offered them an opportunity to muse on the nature of the city's aristocracy. In particular, for instance, they were interested in Genoa's relationship with neighboring powers. Commenting on the aristocracy's apparent poverty, Lady Miller noted during her visit how the aristocracy's famed frugality explained the Republic's survival after 1684. Weak in themselves and unwarlike, they cannot resist any one power, but their safety has hitherto depended and must always depend upon the interests others have in their continuing a free state. Besides, what bribe can Spain, Naples, or even France offer to the Genoese nobility as an equivalent for their liberty? Can they, out of their own houses, see anything desirable in the palaces of kings? Rich in their frugality and the possessions of honors, of powers, and consideration, can a noble Genoese envy the prime minister or favorite of any crowned head in Europe? Travelers to Genoa in the 18th century bore witness to the Republic's system of government, not only in its formal spaces, but also in its informal ones. Visitors in particular assessed the health of the Republic on the city's narrow streets. One of the most common tropes in these travel accounts was of the procession of the Doge. This often offered viewers an opportunity to comment on the Republic's constitutional order. Take the account of the Doge from the British Army artilleryman John Nothel's 1766 travels through Italy, which I think very usefully ties together many of the themes and ideas that we've been circulating around the past 3 days about this kind of tension between republicanism and monarchy. Quote, the Republic of Genoa has a crown and scepter for its Doge by reason of their conquest of Corsica, which had formerly a Saracen king. This gives their ambassadors a more honorable reception at some courts, but at the same time may teach their people to have a mean notion of their own form of government, and is a tacit acknowledgement that monarchy is the more honorable. The link Nothroll suggests here between monarchy and its far more onerous cousin despotism found a neat combination in other travel accounts. In his 1740 account of Genoa, the German traveler Johann Keisler describes the city's tight streets as conveying a deep foreignness. Quote, the want of coaches and other carriages conduces me not a little to the cleanliness of the streets. Besides, the barrenness of the neighboring soil requiring great quantities of manure, the dung of horses and the mules is very carefully gathered up. What some Oriental travelers informed us that the Arabs do out of superstition with regard to those camels which have been in the Mecca caravans, the poor people here do from necessity, carefully picking up all the horse and mule dung they meet with. So, foreign visitors then to Genoa in the 18th century would appear to have cast a fairly dark image of the Republic as decadent and declining, even tipping toward Oriental despotism. But travelers also cast the Republic in a more positive light, taking note, for instance, of the Republic's changing character following the 1684 French bombardment, especially the Republic's commitment to neutrality. What I want to stress here is that as we move away from those sites in the city that most visitors associated with the history of the Republic, the Palazzo Ducale, the Palazzo Doria, we can see foreign travelers envisioning the Republic less as an independent power in its own right, and more as an international center for commerce, finance, and transportation. Travelers to Genoa, for instance, noted how the main civic hospital, the Ospedale di Panettone, cared for infirmed regardless of nationality. Quote, the large hospital is another important establishment where is received all the sick indifferently of whatever nation they may be, reported Joseph Jérôme Lalande during his 1769 visit. Popular too among visitors was Genoa's Portofranco, its free port, near the Molavecchio. Commenters who visited the city during the War of Spanish Succession, for instance, noted how, as one English diplomat put it, the free port had turned into, quote, one giant magazine for the world. Quote, the whole world has seen and pondered it, added another, noting how recruits, armies, ammunition, money, and provisions are all landed at Genoa, unquote. What these sources suggest is that travelers during the 18th century increasingly came to see Genoa less as a free republic in its own right and more as an international neutral center for commerce, finance, and military exchange. Now, with my last few minutes, what I would like to do is to show how these two contrasting ideas of Genoa, one of a decadent Genoa and the other one of a decadent and declining Genoa, and the other one of a Genoa as a European free port open to all, that we can explore this idea, this tension, by examining closely changing contemporary accounts of that most important of Genoese institutions, the Casa di San Giorgio. Now, of course, there was nothing particularly novel about 17th and 18th century European writers commenting on the city's public bank. Along with the Darsegna and the Strada Nova, the Palazzo di San Giorgio was one of the celebrities of the early modern Genoese cityscape, most remarked about by contemporary visitors. But importantly, many of the travelers in the first half of the 18th century came to Genoa with one particular understanding of San Giorgio in their head, that provided by Niccolò Machiavelli in his 1526 Storia Fiorentina. As Carlo Taviani has shown in a recent article, Machiavelli explains San Giorgio as a solve to Genoa's damaged Republican constitution. Foreign visitors then to Genoa in the start of this period followed closely Machiavelli's basic formula. San Giorgio was, in their minds, first and foremost, an exceptional part of Genoa's Republican constitution. Take, for instance, the English poet and essayist Joseph Addison, who describes San Giorgio in appropriately Machiavellian terms during his visit to the city in 1701, noting how, quote, the bank is generally thought the greatest load on the Genoese, and the managers of it have represented as a second kind of senate that break the uniformity of government and destroy in some measure the fundamental constitution of the state. It is, however, very certain that the people reap no small advantage from it, as it distributes the power among more particular members of the Republic and give the commons a figure, so that it is no small check upon the aristocracy, and may be one reason why the Genoese Senate carries it with greater moderation towards their subjects than the Venetians. French travelers noted much the same, Writing in the 1760s, the astronomer and writer Joseph Jérôme de Lalande likened the constitutional place of the Casa di San Giorgio to a chapel inside a larger cathedral. Quote, the Banco di San Giorgio forms a republic of rich people, and the Great Council a republic of politicians and nobles. This view began to change, however, as the century progressed. And increasingly, travelers to Genoa took note not only of San Giorgio's status within the republic, but its international acclaim as a depository for foreign capital. In particular, we can see this change, and this is the last thing I want to touch on here. We can see this change in perspective in a wave of pamphlets produced in 1749 and 1747 in London, immediately following the Austrian expulsion from the city during the War of Austrian Succession, with titles like Accounts of the Late Revolution in Genoa. These anonymous pamphlets attempted to persuade parliamentary politicians to reconsider the British alliance with Savoy and Austria during the war. Now, at the center of these narratives of the siege, surrender, occupation, and revolution of the Genoese was a vision of the Casa di San Giorgio, no longer as part of the Republic, but as a truly international institution worth saving for that reason. This point is made vividly in a 50-page anonymous political pamphlet entitled The Case of the Genoese Impartially Stated, during which the plundering of San Giorgio by occupying Austrian troops was posited as a major cause of the revolt. According to the pamphlet's anonymous author, who claimed to have firsthand knowledge of the uprising, the Genoese, faced with, quote, the natural impossibility of raising the necessary war indemnities to pay off the Austrians, had been, quote, compelled, quote, this most serene commonwealth to have recourse to the last remedy, the laying hands on the sacred depository, the Bank of St. George, where was lodged not only the cash of the subjects of this state, but also that of many other nations. Reporting other crimes the Austrians committed during the heavy-handed occupation, the pamphlet's author noted how at one point, quote, some German officers arrogated to themselves the liberty of entering with an armed force and on horseback into the Porto Franco itself to take a view of it, a procedure which afforded the worst of omens to the traders, who from that time justly apprehended that the merchandise, whether of the Genoese or the foreigners, were as little secure in the asylum of the Porto Franco as their money was in the Bank of St. George. So, you know, what's going on here? What I think so offended the pamphleteer's author about the Austrian occupation was not its threat to Republican freedom, but its threat to global markets and access to capital. To the pamphlet's author, San Giorgio was, quote, the sacred deposit of the wealth of most nations in Europe, which, quote, had been always regarded and remains unviolated during all the convulsions of the state of Genoa, even when the city of Genoa itself was given up to the Marquis of Pescara in 1522 to be plundered by his army. The Bank of St. George was still untouched by the impious ravagers, unquote. So I want to stop here and conclude with this pamphlet because I think it kind of offers a nice place. Here we see that the Casa di San Giorgio, as I just said, that most peculiar element of the Genoese constitutional order is being completely stripped of its Republican context and replaced instead with a new one. It is simply one small part of a European-wide system increasingly controlled by larger powers to Genoa's north. While foreign travelers to Genoa in the 18th century marveled at the city and filled their accounts with what were by that time centuries-old tropes about the nature of the Genoese Republic, they also came to see the Republic as less an independent sovereign in its own right and more a cog in a larger commercial or military machine. I'm going to leave you then with one last quote from this pamphlet, where the author of the case of the Genoese Impartially Stated suggested that the British need not invade Genoa ever and should leave its republic intact, at least for now. Quote, let us leave the Genoese, so tenacious of freedom, the empty name of liberty. We are masters of their capital, command their port, and have troops enough to keep them in awe. Therefore, it is our business to let them remain with the peel of the orange and secure the rich juice for our own use, since rather than appropriate to ourselves the entire fruit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Very interesting paper. A lot of sources examine. Your project is really interesting. All these analysis of these diplomatic correspondences, both French and English, all these written reports by travelers, merchants, and soldiers give us the idea of this conflicting representation of the decadent Genoa and the Genoa's European free port, the land of disparity with the Banca, the Casa di San Giorgio, and the land of liberty. I think that all these elements led us to question about the representation of Genoa entering in the second part of the 17th century with the bombing, with the decadence, the real decadence, and then alongside in the 18th century on the representation of Genoa outside Italy as a imperfect republic, not a full republic. There was all these conflicting elements. So it was land of liberty, but also land of disparity. It was very interesting the fact that within the weakness described of Genoa, there was this point on the fact that the noble are rich and richer than European princes. It is something that returns come back in different writings of that period, and according to my opinion, something very, very clear and very important in order to understand the European representation of Genoa. So thank you very much. I would like to open immediately the discussion. I think that we will have a lot of questions. Maybe we are a little bit tired, so I will start with the first question, and then we have also Professor Herrero Sánchez. I have a couple of questions for Michael, and then one for Professor Luana Salvarani. Michael, I would like to ask you, first of all, connected to this fact that with the representation of this big disparity in Genoa, the nobles that are very rich and all the power of the Republic, and people, sort of very poor people under them, is very different, for example, from the representation of the Dutch Republic. Dutch Republic, everyone is very wealthy, very rich, thanks to the trade. But this is peculiar to the representation of Genoa, with this big disparity. And this is something that we can also find in the, for example, in the Italian historical documents of the second part of the 17th century. I'm thinking about Galeazzo Gualdo Priorato's Relazioni, for example, his Relazione di Genova, which is published, I think, in 1645, but I don't remember very well, states this point: not full republic, land of disparity, aristocracy ruling. So all these elements. And I would like to ask you, first of all, if these historical documents are somehow drawn by the English reports that you have analyzed. And the second very brief question is, are you going to analyze also Italian reports written by Italian authors that went outside Italy and went in England or in the Dutch Republic? I'm thinking at a very special case, that of Gregorio Leti, in the second part of the 16th century and first decades of the 18th. He was first in London and then in Amsterdam, where he will die. And he wrote very interesting reports on all the Italian states, something like John Brevel, and maybe something that could be useful to your research. I don't know, I would like to ask you. And then I have a point for Professor Salvarani. Was very interesting, your paper, your talk. I was thinking about one possible sources, as I've already mentioned, of this Spinola's istituzione. I think that when you were describing these original points, for example, the fact that he talks about gambling, he talks about superfluous and superfluous expenses, how to spend money. It is something that is not peculiar, as you have already said, of the pedagogical treatises. I was thinking about one text published in 1617 of an author that, of course, you may well know, which is who is Ansaldo Cebà, who is author of Il cittadino di Repubblica, which is not a pedagogical treatise in a traditional way. It's more a political, a treatise of political pedagogy, and it contains precisely these points: how the Republican citizen has to spend his money, how must he behave in all the social situation. He has not to gamble, for example. He has to speak more than one language, and he has to speak modern language in order to be understood by French and Spanish diplomats. And a point that is, according to me, very interesting, that could maybe justify this filiation, is the fact that in Ansaldo Cebà treatise, we have the drawing of Justus Lipsius Politicorum Libri Sex. So in some way, his political treatise is a sort of Specula Principis, but revised in a Republican form. So maybe we have in Spinola, I don't know, I would like to ask you and to open even a discussion. If you have any other sources, maybe more appropriate, please tell us. I think that maybe Spinola is here matching two different traditions, the pedagogical tradition and the political tradition belonging to the Republican writings of Genoa. So he perfectly inscribes his work within the republicanism, the republicistic discourse in Genoa. I would like to know your opinion. Now we have the question of Professor Herrero Sánchez, and then we pass to replies. Thank you. Sorry for having stolen a lot of time.
Okay, just two questions for Laura Salvarani. Just a question. I don't know if you have some information. Is no quote Gracian, because I think for this period is for this kind of element, for this kind of discourse, I think was really the topos in this moment. Don't was right. It's for me was very strange, just Huarte, but no Gracian, because he's follow everywhere in this kind of prudence and all this kind of element of the education of princes. But the question is for Emilio Pérez Blanco. No, I was very interesting about the role of Bazin, about this ambassador who helped the Republic of Genoa during the bombing of France and sending a very important military detachment to the town to maintain the order inside. No, but most for that, because he's interested in this text that you have quoted, but he's also in the middle of a very strong and difficult situation, because in this moment the Habsburg, or Vienna and Madrid, are in a strong alliance with the two other naval power, no, the Dutch and the English, no. And the big question there is because the Spain also want to maintain the neutrality and the good relation with Genoa, even if Genoa is in this situation that theoretically Spain want to broke with this link with France, but the reality is not like this, because Spain is forced to declare and provoke embargoes and military economic war against France product, but they using all the time these Genoese ships and the Genoese alliance and neutrality in order to introduce a lot of product, and the Genoese take a very strong position in the second part, at the last 2 decades of the 17th century. They even stronger than Dutch and the English in the Mediterranean, and that provoked a very strong problem between this alliance between the both republics for the Spain. Do you have more information about this situation in this sense, because that maybe it's interesting to know? No, it's not just an alliance with one republic, but maybe in this moment, how to play with the alliance with the republic, what is doing the Habsburg in general during the second part. And it's okay.
Thank you very much. Maybe Luana and Michael, you can answer to this question. Then we have Simona Morando, Alejandro Garcia Monton, and Professor Gors. Please, Luana.
Yes, who answers before, but I will very short. Thank you, Enrico. Yes, I think I also thought about Cheba because this is other suggestions that also makes Pitossi speaking about these treaties. And I think I have to go deeper in it to give a final decision. Of course, he knew this text, and of course he had thoroughly, it's very probably he knew it very well. I have found a difference in the fact that, in my opinion, the Istruzione Familiare is much more projected in this in international dimension, in this international Jesuit global dimension, because in Cheba, I feel that this republic is very founded on Genoese identity and being independent from the outside, also on the cultural. So yes, there is the description of how to spend money, but is and on the financial side is similar. But on the cultural side, I feel this effort to go out Genoa and perhaps the awareness in the Istruzione Familiare that Genoa is anymore a self-standing republic. But also, yes, I have to go more deep in that that I did in a short presentation. So thank you. The suggestion is very important. And also to answer to Professor Sánchez, perhaps I guess you're referring to Oracolo Manuel, perhaps, and I think that could be also this. I have to go deeper, but I feel the style of Spinola very plain. So I think I didn't want to have this multiplicity of meanings and this kaleidoscope that we can find in Graziano Oraculo. I think in Oraculo there are many meanings under the surface that in Spinola in this book, like in generally in pedagogical books, there are not so many meanings under the surface. But yes, with Possevino, we start to have and Huarte a multiplicity. So I don't find it as a direct source, but perhaps an influence. So thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Michael and then Emilio, please.
Enrico, thank you. Those are two excellent questions and suggestions. The second one, going sort of looking at the other side of it, right? I think that's a great idea. I definitely that's sort of the way to proceed. I like that a lot. On the first one, I think it was kind of the circulation of this, or kind of how, the best I can say, I mean, what's interesting about these accounts is that there's this circulation of information about Genoa that's going on, not just in the accounts, but also the accounts talk about information that they've heard about. So there's this sort of, I've read him and he says this, but I see this, right? The one that comes to mind is Anna Miller, who I began the talk with. She goes to the Darsenia and she sees the galley slaves, and then she remarks something along the lines of, I had built up this image of what slavery would be like in my head up in England. And now that I see it, it really isn't all that bad. And they're lucky to be fed and clothed. And it's sort of not as bad of a situation as I had imagined. So you can kind of, in that, you can sort of hear people imagining Genoa very far away and kind of forming an idea of it and then going and seeing it in reality. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We are Emilio for the answer.
Yes. Can you repeat the question, Manuel? Because I've lost communication and I miss a big part of your question. So, don't you mind?
Very briefly, just I want to know if you have some information about the position of the Spanish ambassador in front of the criticism, very strong criticism of the Dutch and the English for this neutrality position. That theoretically there is against that because they wanted Genoa broke also with France in the middle of the war, but at the same time they are profiting of this neutrality and they are instigating this neutrality. And I don't want to know that because for the also what is the position of the Dutch, if you have some information on this accusation, because that I think is a central topic, that because the economic position of the Dutch or the Genoese in the two last decades of the 17th century is very, very strong in Mediterranean Spanish harbor and in America, and that for the maritime power is really delicate situation.
Yes, well, Juan Carlos Bazán was most interested in the Dutch and British Navy more than in their merchants and the relation with Genoa. So I did not find any information about the criticisms towards Genoa. He is more focused on military and navy questions more than economic. Yes, it's surprising, but he later was ambassador to Turin, and again he showed more interest in military issues than, for example, the economic project of William III of intruding clothes in Savoy to help the British industry. For example, Juan Carlos Bazán did not mention this in any of his letters, neither to the Duke of Medinaceli nor the King of Spain.
I think it's a good idea if you can follow the correspondence between Bazán and the ambassador in Spain in Den Haag, is in Embajada de España en La Haya, in Simancas, because you are going to find a lot of information about that, because there is a strong menace from the Dutch, because they are telling, I don't go to help the monarchy if they don't apply very rigorous measures against the republic. I told that because this theoretical solidarity between republic is always very, very real. No, it's more or less in this moment, it's very strong, the aggressivity and accusation of the Dutch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have Simona Morando.
Yes. So I'm very glad for this afternoon. I really wanted to welcome you in Genoa as soon as possible. Really, thank you for this afternoon. I have a little question for Luana. Hi, Luana. When you were talking, I was thinking about another Spinola, Giovanni Andrea Spinola, that wrote a little book called Lo Stoico Cristiano, published in the 60-80, I guess. And I don't know, because I had not time to check if this Spinola is related with your Spinola, if it is the same branch of the family or another branch. But this little book is very important also for the thing you were saying, because it's a book for the son, dedicated to his son. So it's a pedagogical one, we can say, and but it's a very different point of view. You know? Your Spinola talks about international position of Genoa and some very practical issues for the Genoese young people, and in this case we have a philosophical position from a rich person who teaches his son not to care about the richness and the things of the world. So it's a very special point of view, apparently opposite of your Spinola. but I don't know if they are the same family or not in this case, the same branch, because the Spinola, it's a very large family, you know, everyone knows, but I don't know if the same branch of the family. We can study about it.
I think it's very interesting suggestion. The fact that it is later, because it has been published, you said in 1680, so he has written perhaps 30 years later. Perhaps it was all, perhaps if Johann Francesco had seen some weakness in the Republic in the 80s, these problems of the Republic were the bigger problems are approaching. So perhaps there was a full rethinking of the situation. And I think also this, it could be in the line, this later book, in the line of the reflection about religion and religious education, were indeed anti-Jesuits, because there was after the great expansion of the Jesuit between the end of the 16th and the 17th century, there is a lot of religion reflection in anti-Jesuits key. So it's interesting to see this, perhaps these two different ideas in the very different ideas in the same family. And reflecting about Stoicism, it's some way also to go back to the original tradition of humanism, humanistic pedagogy. So I think it's interesting to compare and to find out if there are connections between these two Spinola. So thank you very much.
Thank you to you.
Perfect, thank you very much. Now we have the question of Alejandro Garcia Monton, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrico, for giving me the floor. Thank you all for your papers. I have two questions for Emilio and one question for Emilio and another one for Mike. I will try to explain myself properly. For Emilio, I mean, I'm not a specialist on that, the concrete decade, but I was wondering, because I had the feeling that by using that idea of there are different bandi. So we have the Republicisti party, we have the Hispanophile party. I think that it would be convenient to make a more subtle use of those terms, because at the very end of the day, the way in which Madrid is establishing relationships with this myriad of Genoese oligarchs in Genoa, it goes beyond the political markers, right? So in my impression, I don't know, I would like to know a little bit more about how are you dealing with these categorizations that the Spanish ambassadors are doing in Genoa, because sometimes, well, it's just a political marker to organize a little bit information, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really frame the politics, right? So I would like to know a little bit more about that. This has to do, it came to my mind, right? Luana mentioned before the works of Vitozzi. It was coming to my mind when Vitozzi was explaining us in one of his books of '92, like, well, this distinction between nobili nuovi and nobili vecchi, when we see really how the internal dynamics of the Republic is working, well, it's just a marker, let's say, but in practice. So I would like to know, how are you coping with this problem that anyone that has dealt with Genoa has faced before, right? So I would like to know more about that. And for Mike, I have also a question that leads me to a more general comment. I think, in my perspective, I think that the history of Genoa, or the history of the literature on Genoa, has been a story of a misunderstanding, right? In the sense that is this republic that doesn't really fit in the categories of Renaissance that are constructed in the late 19th century. Well, Genoa as a state doesn't fit much into what we have been told always, what is supposed to be a fiscal military state. And to a large extent, this kind of Orientalist views are reproduced over and over again. to a large extent, I think because of the kind of discourses that these kind of travelers were creating about Genoa, which to my understanding were discourses that what they show is, or what they reflect is a misunderstanding of how really the Genoese state work, not only the state, but let's say the society, right? Because certainly, if we look to the Genoese context, we are not gonna see much military entrepreneurs. We need to look for them in Flanders during the first 2 centuries of the 18th century. We need to look for them in the Mediterranean during the 1730s. We need to look for them in the Atlantic in the 1720s. So in that sense, I'm wondering what is the added value that these sources are bringing to the table, right? Because, or how are you gonna, in a way, try to counterbalance those visions, which, to my understanding, I think that them are telling us more about misunderstanding, right, than about how really the Genoese state, the Genoese society worked, right? I mean, the thing here, I always say it, the example of Genoa is the example of the way that we are going now, a sort of neoliberal state in which the first and more important thing is to protect private property. And then, okay, we will find. I remember Roberto Lopez in a paper in the 1930s. I think he was very, very clever when he said, look, the Genoese found a way to protect themselves thanks to the by free, because at the end the galleys that were operated by the Genoese private entrepreneurs were paid by the Spaniards. So why to develop you know, the typical fiscal military state? So I'm wondering a little bit, how are you going to deal with this extremely polyedric history of Genoa? And I think that is what connects to all of us, that we're fascinated by the fact that it's so polyedric and so difficult to understand, right? So I would like to know, how are you coping with these questions? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Before letting you answer, I would like to collect also the last question by Professor Gors, please.
Oh, thank you. I was fascinated. We usually think about Napoleon in 1797. We can think now about the Austrians and the sacking of Genoa and Casa di San Giorgio. As a sort of, again, beginning of the end, if you will, as Churchill would say. And I wanted to mention Corey Tazara. He's a new colleague of mine here at Scripps. We're developing a course together on cities in the Mediterranean, a wonderful young economic historian, and his book on Livorno. And his point about how Livorno creates a free port model that Genoa imitates and other ports do imitate. So I think Livorno and the Medici come in here as well. I think it would be really good to look at the Physica, beautiful print that you have there, where there's Casa di San Giorgio, there are the ships, and there's the Francoporto right there, and the beautiful way that Renzo Piano redeveloped those magazzini into galleries and restaurants and so forth, so you can really see the physical character of it, I think is really interesting to bring in the comparative element there. As an art historian, I'm always struck by the descriptions, the travel descriptions of Genoa. I'm thinking of Ricard Lascelles and John Evelyn and others like this, of describing the upper city and the lower city. The lower city, the medieval city of the little contradi, the vicoli, the darkness, the dangers, and the kind of luminous upper city of the Palazzi, Strada Nuova, Via Balbi, and so forth. There's a kind of Città Alta, Città Bassa kind of aspect to these, again, that almost become a kind of medieval Renaissance kind of description. And Pileggi, of course, is talking about the Strada Nuova in this way as a Habsburg kind of precinct. And I think that's sort of two sides of the city as well. And I think one of the great appeals to Genoa to me is that these medieval quarters still exist. They weren't torn out in the 19th century, like Florence, for instance, sanitized in the 19th century. You really see them. And I think this is another interesting aspect, the kind of two sides to the way that Genoa is perceived by many, as you alluded to, the grandeur of the palazzi and the ricchezza, but also the sort of dangers and the kind of, again, that you feel in the city today. And I love in the lower city as well, you know, that you kind of international character of the lower city, I think is so fascinating. And I think those are two thoughts that come out with your talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So Emilio and then Michael for the answers. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Alejandro. Well, I have the impression that the Spanish ambassadors did not understand, at least Juan Carlos Bazán did not understand the dynamics of Genoese politics. He moves on very simplistic terms. He believes that there is a French party, but it seems that that French party was not so important as the so-called Spanish party. Moreover, when he writes about the Republicisti, in the report that I showed before, that is the first time in 9 years as ambassador that he mentions the Republicisti. And they do not appear in any of the rest of his correspondence. So I think that I think that Juan Carlos Bazán, for the situation that he was experiencing during the 9 years war, he could be a bit paranoid, believing that there was a French party. That was strange. France was near to Genoa, and the French army was in Piedmont. So he truly believed that those complaints of the Republic or the defense of its neutrality was due to some kind of secret alliance between the Genoese rulers and a French party. But just a moment, let me search in my paper. Yes. He believed at first that there was an important French party in Genoa, but at the end, in 1693, he considered that this was an exaggeration. So the rulers of Genoa were faithful to Spain, only they wanted to avoid a new bombing of the city. Does this answer your question?
Yeah, it was more like a sort of methodological question. To what extent, how are you dealing with these markers, and what is the validity that you give to them, and in a way, how are you dealing with the images that the Spanish ambassador is creating about the internal political organization of the Genoese oligarchy? So yeah,
I have to admit that I need to search more sources, and I've not been to Genoa, so there is a lack of sources, and I need to complete. So in that case, I can answer your question regarding methodology. For now, I'm using the Spanish sources but I need to contrast them, of course.
Okay, so, thanks.
Thank you.
You, Michael?
Yeah. First, Alejandro, I think you're completely right in saying that, in noting that the value of these sources is not in their originality, right? I think you're right in saying that in many ways they're kind of replicating a narrative that we know that people assume of Genoa, which is that this idea of decadence and decline, and that in no way surprised me when I read them. What did surprise me though is that there's this sort of other narrative that's going on there, because as once the city becomes neutral, it really does open up all sorts of interesting possibilities from a military point of view and an economic and a commercial point of view that is being included in these very subtle and nuanced ways in accounts of the city. So people, the travelers who go there, become much more interested in the Freeport and much more interested in the Ospedale and much more interested in the Casa di San Giorgio, not as a reflection of a kind of debate about decline or debate about the nature of the Republic, but because these are important strategic resources on a regional or even a European level. And that's what I think kind of gets drawn out there. Yeah. And that kind of pivots nicely to what Professor Gorst, what you noted. Yes, I know Gorst Tata. He's a friend of mine. So it's great to hear that you get to teach a course with him. Although I disagree with him in his book, he compares the Livorno Freeport and the Genoa Freeport in a very, and casts the Genoese Freeport in a very negative way. And while I agree with him that, I mean, they're two completely, they're very different institutions, and we don't need to get into that right now. But that what he looks at primarily is non-military commerce. So if you're thinking about Livorno as this open city where commerce can move everywhere, it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about civilian commerce. But if you're talking about military assets, things like grain that need to be secured, and because if someone starts robbing your grain, then you have a serious strategic issue. European powers really want to use the Freeport magazines. And there's all sorts of sources that I've looked at about this question of using the Freeport magazines during the War of Spanish Succession, where there's all these debates about who gets what and where, and keeping the port as open as possible. And this almost leads to direct conflict a number of times between the Genoese and the French, or the Genoese and the English, or the Dutch. So yeah, I think, well, I guess there's not really an answer there. I'm excited to, it sounds like a great course.
Thank
sounds
you.
like you're going to have a great time.
I'll bring it up with.
Oh yes, you should certainly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this wonderful conference. I want to thank our keynote speaker. I want to thank you all, our speaker. The papers were really great. I want to thank all the members of the scientific committee. We have here Simona Morando and Giacomo Montanari. Unfortunately, Laura Stagno had to leave us before the conclusion. But now I would like to let Alessandro, to give the floor to Alessandro for a final remark. So thank you very much. Thank you all.
Well, I will be very brief because it's kind of late, even if we have many Spanish guests. So maybe for them it's not as late as, but okay, we are all tired, and that has been a great conference. So thank you again. And as I said yesterday, I'm not an expert, I'm not a scholar on the topic. So I have to thank once again Enrico Zucchi, the true mastermind behind all this. And of course, I also want to thank you, because I learned so many things about early modern Genoa. And I was really struck by the last slide by Michael, the empty name of liberty, because that made me think of the wonderful lecture, the wonderful keynote lecture that Professor Herrero Sánchez gave us on the first day. And well, at the end of all this conference, I wouldn't say that liberty was an empty name for early modern Genoa, but rather a conceptual area full of different things. And it's very hard to define this idea of liberty. Maybe the most common definition we have found during these 3 days is this idea of being independent despite a political influence, and which is an idea we found in the Avvisi, that was really clear, but also in the wonderful paper we had adopting an economical and financial perspective, so that there's this strong idea of a liberty that has to be saved no matter what. At the same time, if we look to the field of the cultural production, well, there's also Genoa personification, or prosopopoeia maybe in rhetorical terms. Maybe the myth of the libertas in Genoa is not as triumphant as in Venice, but we have seen that the many personifications, as I said, of Genoa or Liguria showing their shield with libertas on it, remember us that this idea of liberty was also a way to shape a certain representation of the city. And then, of course, there's encomiastic literature for the laudatory strategies of books and about Genoa. We have seen this in Professor Toso's papers and in other papers that have been discussed in these days. Well, all these literary works simply cannot do without liberty, even if we are not in Venice, even if the conception of this liberty is quite difficult. Well, of course, for a large part of Genoese culture is fundamental. And we also quote Ansaldo Ceba and the Repubblicisti, where we can even talk, I think, of a rhetoric of liberty. So I think that this theme, of course, we should go deeper in it. But for now, just let me say that all these different approaches coming from different disciplines really helped us in our project trying to make different scientific views communicate and work together. So once again, thank you for these wonderful days. And of course, I hope that we will work again on such topics, and maybe we could do this in Genoa. And of course, that's the last wish that I want to say to you all, because of course, it has been a pleasure working with you here on Zoom, but it will be an even greater pleasure to welcome you in Italy, and namely in Genoa, whenever this will be possible. Thank you once again for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would
And
love
have
to
a nice evening.
It would be great to have Luana and Giacomo Montanari talk about libraries in Genoa as well. I think that was resonating in my mind, Luana, with your wonderful paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Everybody.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.